Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be hand stitching the leather covering that I'm going to need for a traditional bellows that I'm working on for a portable forge. When I looked at the antique bellows that were available in local museums, I noticed that the leather was always sewn using a standing seam. By that I mean when the leather is unfolded and laid flat, the edges curl up and are actually sitting 90 degrees to the rest of the leather. I just couldn't figure out why they wouldn't use a simple lap joint that would allow the leather to lay flat up against the sides of the bellows. And then I realized that this method places all the stitching on the outside of the bellows, so if this seam ever needed to be repaired at a later date, everything is on the outside and readily accessible. So what you see here is the pattern that I developed for the complete leather covering that I need for my bellows. It's a little bit over 8 feet long and it's roughly 30 inches wide at its widest point. I traced this pattern from a full-size cardboard mock-up that I had of the finished bellows. And then I took the pattern back and forth between the leather and the cardboard mock-up that I made to establish the largest possible bellows that I would be able to make with the leather that I had. When you're deciding how to cut the pattern up to fit it on the leather, you want to try to keep the largest possible pieces for the very back of the bellows. This is where the leather needs to flex the most, and a single piece of leather will bend and flex a lot better than something that's pieced together. If you need to cut the pattern on this area, cut it on the center line that's going to be nailed to a rib anyway. You want to try to avoid any vertical seams in this area. So here's the finished pattern laid out on the leather. Now that I know it's going to fit, I can take apart my cardboard mock-up and use it as a pattern for the wood of the actual bellows. To do a good job of hand stitching leather, the leather needs to be secured in some kind of a clamp. This is a clamp I made out of a 2x4 and a couple of bolts. The extra long handle is so I can clamp it horizontally in my workmate, and this positions the jaws off the edge of the workmate so there's lots of room underneath it for all that leather. The jaws are made wide enough so I can clamp the entire width of the leather that I need to stitch without having to readjust it. The bevel on the top edge can be any angle, it's just to give you some room for your fingers to get close to the work. The easiest way to get the leather into this clamp is to take the clamp apart and lay the long jaw on its side on a table. Position the leather on top of the jaw on the table and then reassemble the clamp before mounting it into the workmate. I'm going to be using a saddle stitch to sew the leather together. This heavy cord represents the sewing thread that I'm going to be using, and the ruler is to show the relationship between the cord and the leather. The saddle stitch is made with a single thread that has a sewing needle at both ends. You start the stitch by passing one of the threads through the leather, and then you complete the stitch by passing the opposite end of the thread through from the other side. Because you have two threads going through a single hole, one is going to naturally want to sit on top of the other. The secret of the saddle stitch is to make sure that that relationship always stays the same. So in this example, the thread on the left-hand side of the work is always going through the leather first, and then it's followed by the right-hand thread. I'm going to be using a variation on the basic saddle stitch. It starts off the same way as a basic saddle stitch, only this time I'm taking the left hand thread and creating an overhand knot. This overhand knot gets locked inside the leather and really helps to keep the stitches tight while you're sewing. The important thing to remember with this variation of the saddle stitch is to create the overhand knot exactly the same way with every stitch. In this example, I'm starting the same way with the left hand thread followed up by the right, only this time I'm taking the left hand thread and looping it from underneath to create the overhand knot. This keeps that relationship of the left hand thread being on top and the right hand thread being on the bottom. Being very methodical in your approach is the only way to create that zigzag stair-step pattern of the classic saddle stitch. So now I'll demonstrate how it actually looks when I'm doing the sewing. The leather is in the clamp and I have it positioned a little bit higher than I need it. I'm going to do the stitching and then trim down to the stitch line when I'm done. Leather sewing needles are just basically wires that hang onto the thread. The tips are blunt. They don't actually make the hole in the leather. They're just a means of getting the thread through the leather. The holes are made using an awl. This is an antique sewing awl and it's diamond in cross section. The outside edges are sharp, so it cuts a hole into the leather. I haven't laid out the holes in any way. I'm just using the straight edge of the clamp as a guide to create a straight sewing line, and I'm just going to eyeball the distance between the stitches. I'm going to punch all of the holes first. Again, the clamp is holding the leather very securely, so I'm not worried about the leather moving, and it makes it a lot easier to make sure that the angle of the sewing awl is always the same for each hole. Now that all the holes are punched, I can just concentrate on the sewing. To start sewing, you pass one of the needles through the first hole and pull it through until there's an equal length of thread on each side of the leather. And then you can start the actual saddle stitch. Here I'm going to be doing it exactly the same way as I showed you earlier. I'm going to start with the left hand thread. Follow it up with the right hand thread. Make sure that the needle is coming out on top of the loop that was created by the left hand thread. And then create the overhand knot with the left hand thread. And then you tighten the stitch until the overhand knot is buried inside the leather. And then it's just a matter of following this exact sequence until you're done the seam. Here's how the row of stitching looks so far. When I'm done, I'm going to trim the top edge until it's about 1/8 of an inch away from the actual stitch line. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.